discussion of medical ethics today, and we are going to think about two things. We're going to think about the coronavirus pandemic, and we're going to think about how certain theories of justice can speak to some of the questions that emerged right at the beginning of the pandemic. So the plan today is that in light of discussions of COVID-19 and coronavirus lockdowns, we're going to think about four approaches to justice: the Rawlsian, utilitarian, libertarian, and communitarian approaches. And the reading that we're going to use as our anchor point for this discussion is a piece by John Authers called "How Coronavirus is Shaking Up the Moral Universe." This was a brief essay published in a book called The Ethics of Pandemics, which was released very early on in the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020. So in certain ways, taking this perspective from 2024, in many ways, we know more about how things turned out than our author did. But as we'll see, thinking about the pandemic is going to give us a really good opportunity to think about different approaches to the question of what justice is and what a just approach to healthcare might look like. So just to refresh you on where we got last time, our author Gillen in the British Medical Journal and Dunn and Hope in our textbook, they both run us through a famous approach to medical ethics. This was an approach developed by Beecham and Childress, but this is sometimes called the Four Principles approach to medical ethics. And there we say, in each case, we're going to find some mixture in terms of its ethical dimensions, in terms of autonomy, our responsibility to respect the choices of patients, beneficence. This is the duty of healthcare workers to bring benefit to their patients. Non-maleficence. This is a duty to not bring harm to patients. And then the last thing that we got is justice. Now, in our paper by Gillen, he notes that justice is sort of a multifarious kind of concept. It means different things and different concepts. And here are some of the different things that authors suggest that justice might mean. He says it could mean fair distributions of benefits and burdens. It could mean the non-violation of people's rights. It might mean respect for the law. Now, he qualifies this somewhat. He says that justice requires you to follow the law, just so long as the law is itself morally acceptable and so long as the law was generated through democratic means. And then the last thing he points out, justice can mean treating equals equally. He uses the term horizontal justice to refer to that. And also non-equals unequally. So people who need more might get more, or people who have done better will get better treatment. That would be referred to as vertical justice. Now, today we're going to take a closer look at this concept of justice as it's going to apply to public health and medical ethics. So think about all the things that were going on at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we saw rather suddenly, beyond panicking about having resources. This is why a lot of grocery stores ran out of toilet paper. But we also found a quick decision to shut down businesses, shut down schools in order to protect the health of the population in general, but especially elder people and immunocompromised people. And this is going to bring us to our first theory. Now, Authors says that the way we responded to COVID-19 at the outset, he thinks is deeply inspired by this philosopher, John Rawls. So here's the first thought. Rawls thinks that genuine moral standards, and this is just moral standards and just rules for society, are going to be those that free, equal, and rational people would choose from behind the veil of ignorance. Now, what does Rawls mean by this veil of ignorance? Well, it's an imaginary device that Rawls comes up with, and he's using it as a simulator for fair bargaining conditions. Right? So another way that we could understand Rawls's theory of justice is that just laws are the laws that we would arrive at under fair bargaining conditions. So here's what's going to happen with the veil of ignorance. When we write the rules for how we're going to live together in society, Rawls has us imagine a bunch of people coming together and bargaining about what those rules for society will be. But what they don't know while they're making this bargain is who they are going to be. That is, what their position in society is. So when you're making the bargain, you don't know what your race will be. You don't know what your gender will be. You don't know what your economic position will be. You might be born to richer parents, or you might be born to poorer parents. And then Rawls's question is, well, what rules will we arrive at if you think that there's an equal chance of you being the one richest person in society as opposed to being the one poorest person in that society? And here is the suggestion that Rawls makes. If we're thinking about the rules we're going to arrive at when we don't know what position we're going to be in, we're going to have to take into consideration everybody's interests and concerns. And it generates two rules. The first, Rawls says, we want a good theory of rights. So he says one rule that we're going to have for a fair society is that everybody should get the most extensive set of basic rights as possible. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to give everybody the right to do everything, because if everybody has the right to do everything, well, that might actually lead to some people having their rights violated. So the right to harm others, for instance, well, that would limit the right of safety and bodily autonomy to others, right? But we want to think about what is the biggest set of rights we can get for everybody. And Rawls is going to say, it doesn't mean you get to do anything whenever you want, but it will get you freedom of speech, it will get you freedom of religion, basic property rights, he thinks. So this is the first big rule that we're going to come up with from behind the veil of ignorance. Second thought is Rawls gives us a theory of distributive justice, right? So this is about how we're going to divide up our goods and resources within society. And here's Rawls's thought there. He's going to say, if there's going to be rich people and poor people in a society, we're going to make sure to arrange society so that even if you wind up in the worst case scenario, so we're going to arrange society so that even the worst off position is going to be as good as it can possibly be, right? In some places, Rawls refers to the reasoning behind this as maximin reasoning. Now, maximin reasoning basically just means maximize the minimum. Make the worst case scenario as good as it can possibly be. So Rawls gives us these two general principles for what a just society will look like. Everybody has some basic liberties, but we're also going to structure society so that there's a certain sharing of resources, so that even the worst off are going to have access to enough resources such that even the worst case scenario would be acceptable. After all, when you're bargaining from behind the veil of ignorance, you're going to make sure that even if you wind up in the worst situation, you're going to be doing okay. And as Authors notes in your reading, this Rawlsian approach is used as a justification for the contemporary welfare state, right? This is why we have programs like food stamps and other sorts of social assistance. It's to make sure that even if you're really struggling, certain aspects of social welfare are going to make sure that you're doing at least okay at the minimum. So, how does this apply to COVID? Well, we're going to ask, are basic liberties violated? And then we're going to say, do the rules that we apply look out for the least well-off among us? And Authors is going to point out that the Rawlsian outlook is going to say, look, even if some people might do just fine if they catch COVID, it poses extra risk for those who are elderly and immunocompromised. This was especially the case before we found effective treatment options for COVID. And Authors points out that this Rawlsian outlook, Authors thinks that it shares a great deal with religious perspectives, but especially the Golden Rule. If you look into any of the major religions, whether that be Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Hinduism, in all of these major religions, there is some version of the Golden Rule, right? Treat others like you would like to be treated. Now, that's not the exact wording that we get from Rawls, but we might say, look, there is a sense in which looking out for the least well-off among us, because we have to take their concerns and interests into consideration, it is quite similar to the Golden Rule. I'll agree with Authors that there is a parallel to be drawn here, even if it's not exact. So how is this going to apply to the pandemic? Well, if we're taking this sort of Golden Rule approach, or to think about it in more Rawlsian terms, if we're thinking in terms of making the worst case scenario as good as we can possibly make it, we're going to promote lockdowns with the motivation of protecting those with the most risks to their health. Now, this isn't the only theory. Now, we learned about utilitarianism last week. This is the theory that says you're doing the right thing so long as the thing that you're doing creates the greatest amount of overall utility, right? You add up all the improvements to well-being, you subtract all the detriments to well-being, and you look for the choice that's going to lead to the greatest surplus of happiness over suffering when we consider the happiness over suffering of every single individual. So we could ask this question, do policies related to COVID-19 lockdowns maximize overall utility? And to the extent that utilitarianism makes some questions hard, it's often because it's hard to know what action will lead to the greatest amount of utility. Now, former President Trump, while he was the president in spring 2020, made a claim like this: we can't let the cure for COVID be worse than the disease. And this is actually a utilitarian line of thought. We might say, look, if saving the lives of a certain number of people is going to come at the cost of ruining the economy, which will actually end up killing other people in the long run, we might say that that would be the cure being worse than the disease. And we do know that COVID-19 would eventually kill over 1 million Americans. And in that sense, we probably would not say that preventing the spread of COVID was worse than the disease, so long as we can think to ourselves that if we had not had certain safety measures, lockdowns, masking mandates, and so forth, we might think, well, we might have had even more people die of COVID-19 than otherwise. Now, in the United Kingdom, there was a person named Dominic Cummings. He was an advisor to the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson. And apparently, Cummings said that the best thing for Britons to do would be to aim for herd immunity. And his thought was, well, let everybody catch the virus. They will be sick for a couple of weeks. And then once they get better, we as a society, by and large, will have herd immunity. If you have enough immunity within a society, then the virus cannot spread anymore. And then makes the further claim, if some pensioners die, too bad. So the thought is we can get on with our lives, get the economy back up and running. And there are costs to the herd immunity approach, but we might think if the benefits are large enough, then that would justify such a claim. This is utilitarian thinking. Now, authors points out, many people find this sort of reasoning, sort of thinking about the trade-offs between people's deaths and the economy, they find it repugnant, right? And in fact, Cummings and Johnson eventually denied that they made this claim. Well, let's save the economy. If some pensioners die, too bad. Although other people in the United Kingdom, researchers like Philip Thomas, I believe at the University of Bristol, said, like, look, what needs to be done is a 12-month lockdown followed by vaccines for everyone, and we should stick with that plan so long as the economy, the GDP, doesn't sink by more than 6.4%. If things sink by more than that, at that point, letting the virus spread would actually be less costly than continuing to ruin the economy. But here we're taking an approach to big policy questions on utilitarian grounds. Authors thinks that this is not how people thought about the pandemic early on, although as the lockdown went on, and authors predicted this, maybe some people were less willing to incur the costs of stopping the spread of COVID-19. Further approach. This is a libertarian approach to justice. We got a hint of it in Rawls, because Rawls told us that the first rule of justice is to give everybody a certain set of basic liberties. But libertarians take this even further. They think that justice is fundamentally about these basic liberties. So in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, here's like a general view of what utilitarians think. They strongly value individual freedom and see this as justifying strong protections on individual freedom. Thus, libertarians insist that justice poses stringent limits to coercion, right? This would be like government rules wherein a person is told, if you don't do X, you will get punishment Y, right? Now, while people can justifiably be forced to do certain things, such as refraining from violating the rights of others, they can't be coerced to serve the overall good of society or even their own personal good. So, line of thought here. It might be for the good of society for everybody to stay home for a few months because of the pandemic. But the libertarian view would say, look, even if it is for the good of society, even if it does look after the worst off and the most vulnerable, it is wrong for the government to coerce people into doing so. So key figures in libertarian thought, John Locke, Robert Nozick, Ayn Rand are sometimes notable names in this sort of approach that focuses on justice as largely not being interfered with by the state. So when we apply this to pandemic ethics, we'll see things like this, skepticism about lockdown regulations, and we might see a focus on individual liberty here. So a libertarian might be more willing to say than other philosophers that if a business owner wants to keep their bar open during the pandemic, and if private citizens want to go to the bar, they have every right to take that risk, no matter how foolish it might be. Among libertarians, we also find skepticism about government-mandated vaccines. So a requirement to have a vaccine in order to attend school or attend a concert or to continue working at your job, libertarians would say that this sort of coercion is unacceptable. Now, oftentimes libertarianism gets associated with right-wing, that is, Republican-coded politics, but it's not necessarily a right-wing approach. So a left-leaning advocacy group, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was also willing to claim skepticism about quarantines, lockdowns, and travel bans. They said that insofar as they found these approaches not to be scientifically justified, they were therefore an unjust restriction on individual liberty. And in that way, we might see libertarian thought on both sides of the political aisle. And a final approach. So we've looked at Rawls, we've looked at utilitarianism and libertarianism. Here's a fourth one, the communitarian approach. Communitarianism is a political philosophy most famously defended by this philosopher, the Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel. The Stanford Encyclopedia gives us a nice snapshot of what communitarianism is. And they say communitarianism is the idea that human identities are largely shaped by different kinds of constitutive communities or social relations. And this conception of human nature should inform our moral and political judgments as well as policies and institutions. Okay, let's hit pause there. What are we to say when we say that an identity is shaped by your community or social relations? Well, it might be this. You are not a freestanding, independent individual, but in fact, you are a largely dependent individual. And who you are, what your identity is going to be determined by the social relations that you're in. So you might see yourself as maybe a son or a sibling or a parent or a pet owner or a member of a school. My students at UNCG, you are Spartans, right? And insofar as you are a member of that community, that makes part of what you are, right? So who you are is shaped by the communities that you're in. And when we think about justice, we're going to think about the fact that you are not an individual as much as you are a member of a community. So we live our lives in community, similar to lions who live in social groups rather than individualistic tigers who live alone most of the time. Going back to Sandel, in an interview towards the beginning of the pandemic, he said, look, what we need to think about in the context of pandemics and other public crises is about the common good. And Sandel says that the common good is about how we live together in a community. It's about the ethical ideals we strive for together and the benefits and burdens we share. And when you hear common good, you might think, isn't that just utilitarianism again? Because utilitarians were talking about this thing that we call overall well-being, where everybody counts equally. But the communitarian approach is slightly different because it's saying not only do we have to focus on the interests of the whole community, but we have to think about how the interests of each individual within that interlinked community are taken care of. We might also notice that it's not exactly the same thing as Rawls's approach, because instead of talking about individual liberties for Rawls or the libertarianism approach, under the communitarian approach, we talk about ethical ideals we strive for together. Right? One thing that Rawls really insists on is freedom of conscience. That a just society is going to make room for different people who think differently, such that one of our basic liberties should be freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of religions. And I think that Sandel will believe in those things to a large extent, but he also thinks that a community will lose something if we're not striving for certain ethical ideas together. If we're all just pursuing our own individual idea of what's good, we won't be pursuing the ideal of the common good, values that we share together. So we get applications of this communitarian approach. One thing that happened in New York City while people were locked down during the pandemic is that they would, step out onto their balconies around 7 o'clock every night, or actually I think it was exactly at 7 o'clock every night, and they would clap their hands. Sometimes they would bang on pots and pans in order to thank healthcare workers, for making a considerable risk towards their own well-being by treating people during a pandemic, right? So this can be an approach that favors lockdowns. We might also think that maybe there can be an anti-lockdown approach that is also communitarian in flavor. So Authors points out the case of the lieutenant governor of Texas, a person named Dan Patrick. And Patrick claimed that he'd exchange a risk to his own life to preserve the America that he loves for his children and grandchildren. Right. So here we might think that overall well-being, or even the well-being of particular individuals, looking after the most vulnerable among us, maybe that should be sacrificed if it comes into tension with what Patrick seems to think of. This is Authors' interpretation, that an American value, one of the ethical ideals would be American prosperity and also freedom, right? We might also say, look, we should put our lives on the line to let people be free to make choices for themselves. Or if you don't want to think about it in terms of freedom, that gets very close to libertarianism. It might also be speaking to American values of prosperity and work. So we can see all sorts of different approaches to COVID policy through these different lenses of justice. Now, Authors thinks that the Rawlsian approach is the approach that has been most prominent at the start of COVID-19. This idea that we look out for the least well-off among us. But he says that as time goes on, as people start to realize the costs of staying in lockdown, utilitarian strands of thought, libertarian strands of thought, and communitarian strands of thought are going to become more predominant. The other thing we'll notice about this essay by Authors is that it is written very early in the pandemic. So he was mainly thinking about questions of lockdowns and personal liberties versus looking out for the vulnerable among us. but we can ask more questions about justice, or at least what the ethics of good policy would look like. So by the time we get to 2021, we start asking questions about when vaccines are scarce, who gets them first? Should it be first come, first served? Should it be elderly people? Should it be healthcare workers? Should it be people who stand to contribute the most to the economy? Another question, what considerations should be factored into triage decisions involving ventilators? By the time we get to, I think it was the end of 2021 and into early 2022, we had the Omicron variant. And cases were getting so high that decisions about who got ventilators or who got bed space actually had to be made. And we might start asking questions. Well, should we take into consideration age or disability or socioeconomic status? How might factoring these in or failing to factor them in, how does justice speak to those questions? And a last thing we might look at is disincentives. So there are some people who falsely believe that vaccines are unsafe or ineffective. That's largely untrue. Although vaccines have risks, oftentimes the risk of not taking the vaccine is larger. But we did find a situation in which once people who got the vaccines and wanted them, we had people who had a vaccine available to them but were refusing, often on the grounds of personal freedom or on the basis of sometimes misinformation about putative but false dangers involved with vaccination. But we might ask the further question, in a just society, you don't punish people for having false beliefs. But people were mandated to receive vaccines in various ways, which means there were certain consequences for refusing to vaccinate yourself or your children. So this involved consequences like exclusion from public schools, dismissals from jobs, and restrictions on international travel. We also found for a stretch of time that it would be very hard to attend, say, a concert or a sporting event without providing proof of vaccination. We might start to ask the question of to what extent we can limit people's freedom to do things as they choose in light of their vaccination status. And one thing that we can do here is we can pause and we can look through these approaches. So we can look at the Rawlsian approach. Does it respect basic liberties? Does it look out for the most vulnerable among us? We could look at the utilitarian approach. We could ask, does this promote overall well-being? We could look at the libertarian approach. Does it give precedence to individual liberty? Is it strongly against government coercion? Or we might also take the communitarian approach. Does it acknowledge the sociality of our nature and the ways in which our living in communities forms our identities and our evaluations of our social institutions? So I'd invite you to keep on thinking about the questions of justice that have emerged through the pandemic. And now that the virus has become endemic rather than pandemic, maybe what new questions continue to emerge? And as you start reflecting about these questions, you might also start to think about which of these four theories most helps you articulate what you're thinking and what you're trying to say. So that's it for this time. In my next video, we're going to look at a chapter from our textbook by Dunn and Hope called Inconsistencies of Madness. And yeah, these are the readings that we looked at for today. In any case, thanks as always for listening in. And until next time, be well.